This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 132 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's a really special episode because the Thoughtful Travel Podcast has just turned 3 years old. On the day this episode is released, it'll be exactly 3 years and 1 day since I launched the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's easy for me to remember because I launched on my birthday, on a significant birthday, in fact on my 40th birthday. And that's 3 years ago, so you do the maths. I seem to keep getting older, but the good thing is my podcast keeps going from strength to strength along with that, so that makes me feel a bit better. So welcome to the special 3rd anniversary episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I have got a few snippets of interesting info for you to start off with, and then I've got some listener questions that I found from the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers from some of you wonderful, lovely listeners. So I'll be answering them as well. And all the while, I hope you are imagining me here in my party gear, celebrating with champagne and streamers and balloons the 3rd birthday of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I sometimes can't believe that it's still going after, 3 years in 132 episodes is actually quite a lot of work. It doesn't feel like a lot of work. It's just a lot of little bits added onto each other, but it adds up, and I have to say I'm quite proud that I've made it this far, and that I still love doing it so much. So let me start off with a couple of interesting statistics. In little known fact, perhaps, my first degree was a maths degree, so I do love looking at the odd statistic, but it's okay, I'm not going to bore you with lots of them. I just have a couple of exciting things. So first of all, today, so I'm recording this a few days ahead of release, but it's in the same week at least. Today, the number of members of the Thoughtful Travellers group on Facebook ticked over 500. So yay! It's really exciting to have so many cool people to chat to about thoughtful travel topics. So if you're not a member, do come and join us because it is awesome fun. And we have all sorts of interesting conversations there. Recently, for example, my son, who's about to turn 9, had his school swimming carnival. And here in Australia, going to a swimming carnival with your classmates is a fairly regular thing. It's, pretty much a rite of passage. It's something you look forward to each year. And it's a really fun day out. And it did occur to me that maybe that's a bit Australian, and so that's the sort of thing that I was talking about in the Thoughtful Travellers group. And I posted a picture of the pool, and we had a great discussion about the different kinds of school activities in different countries. And I love just learning, how things are different in different places. It's one of my favourite things to do. So that's exciting to have more than 500 people in there now. And speaking of people, I could look up in the statistics from my podcast host that the Thoughtful Travel Podcast has now been downloaded in 145 different countries. So that kind of feels like, most of the world, at some stage there has been at least one episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast downloaded, which is so cool. Let me tell you the top 10 countries though. They're probably not too surprising, but now ahead, used to be Australia was the most downloaded place, but now the US is the most, followed by Australia, which kind of makes sense because I'm Australian and lots of my friends and family and, people I know here would download it. Followed by the UK, Germany, Canada, New Zealand, Brazil, Spain, Italy, and Sweden. So there's a bunch of other, European and Asian countries which follow quite closely after that. So I have to say it's pretty close. But that's the top 10. And, it's really cool to imagine people in so many different places being able to listen to my cool guests each week and, think about their travels and learn something more. Now, I also thought it's an interesting exercise to look at what the top episodes have been. Now, just so you know, the whole statistics that I'm recording here actually only go back as far as mid-2017 when I changed hosts after Jackrabbit FM closed down, where I initially ran the podcast. But nonetheless, I think the stats would be pretty much the same because most of the top 10 are from the past year or so. And I think that's probably because the podcast really started to get a lot more downloads once people started listening to podcasts on Spotify. So before that, it was always a lot was the Apple Podcasts app on iPhones. But these days, the biggest number of listeners, or the biggest proportion, comes from Spotify. And so since that's happened, I think that those later episodes have become more popular. So the most popular episode ever, apparently by quite a margin actually, and then the rest of them are all about the same, was episode 94 about how travel changes kids. And that's really interesting to me, and I hadn't even realised that was the case. So apparently there's a lot of demand to know how travel changes kids. I hope it's in a positive sense. Others in the top 10 were travelling as an introvert. It's always been a popular episode. Talking to locals, life-altering travel moments. The review I did of 2018, talking all about my travels and my podcasting for the year. Another popular one is teaching English as a second language. So I imagine there's still lots of people out there looking for ways to travel and earn money at the same time, which is exactly what I did. 18 years ago when I headed off for Japan and then Slovakia and Germany. So I think it's a wonderful way to explore the world. Also, a lot of love for our hiking episode, solo travel tips, spending years abroad, and choosing your next destination. So that rounds out the top 10 of episodes. So I now want to go on to answering some of the questions that I was given in the recent episode, on the Facebook group. And the first one comes from Kim. And Kim wanted to know how I choose accommodation, especially with Mr. 8. In fact, to be precise, Kim asked me, how do I choose my accommodations, which is a lovely little cultural difference there, because Kim, I know, is American, and I, of course, am not. And so for me, it's accommodation, but for Kim, it's accommodations. But I'm going to convert it into my language now. So she said, and Kim travels full-time, but she said she tries to do her due diligence, but it's hit and miss. And, of course, Kim, it's still hit and miss for me as well. I don't have a magic formula, but I do love booking accommodation. I don't know. I always try and do kind of slow travel trips. And for example, in a couple of months, we're off to Denmark, and I recently booked my Airbnb in Copenhagen. And I do spend a lot of time comparing and reading reviews and, doing all that. So probably, Kim, exactly what you do when you say you do your due diligence. And I do love to look at the location and be really confident that it's where I want to be. Like, do I want to be taking public transport? Do I want to be riding a bike? That's something I'm considering for Copenhagen. And, what's the purpose? Do I need to just spend a night there and then go to the airport? Or am I going to stay there for a couple of weeks and I want it to be, more like a temporary home? So there's all sorts of things that go into it. And I think, I'm looking back, I've never really had a terrible place to stay, but also I'm really easygoing and I don't really care what places are like as long as they're basically safe and basically clean. Like, I'm really not very fussy, and to me it's just some place to sleep. And that's not to say I don't enjoy staying in great places. Like, if I think of when I travelled around Iceland and I had some amazing Airbnb places in Iceland, like a grass-roofed cottage and a half-built designer house by a lake, and really cool places, and I loved them. And I would choose them over a fancy hotel any day because I'm not a real hotel fan. That's, I find hotels a bit noisy and often a bit bland and not really my favourite places. But I guess, long story short, Kim, I have no idea how you can be really sure about accommodation. I'm sure you do just the same as me and read all the reviews and do your best. And touch wood, I've never had a terrible situation yet. But, yeah, I don't know. And even if you end up with something terrible or something so bad that you have to then move, it's all part of the story and part of the experience. So I guess that's kind of my answer to that. Okay, now Narelle asked the interesting question of how do I decide where to go next, and how do I manage the intersection of like my own personal interests, the other travellers. So usually for me, that's my son, who's 8 but very nearly 9. And also Narelle mentioned, what about the interests of my audience? So, I'm going to end up telling you guys through the podcast or through my blog at Not a Ballerina about my destinations and where I've been. So do I consider the audience? Now, how do I decide where to go next? Really the thing is I want to go everywhere, and I just kind of let destinations find me. For example, in a couple of months, we're going to Thailand. It's for a family wedding. My son's cousin from Germany, Switzerland, long story, is getting married in Thailand. So I knew we were going to Thailand. And then what else will we do? I was looking out for an airfare that would help us to extend that trip a little bit. Since we're already leaving Australia, we might as well make, something more out of it. I was thinking kind of somewhere in Asia, but then this amazing airfare came up with Thai Airways, and we were able to continue on to Copenhagen. And it was really, a great bargain. Copenhagen, of course, is very close to Billund in Denmark, which is where Legoland is, and the Lego house, and my son is obsessed with Lego. So that just kind of seemed natural. Of course we'll do that. Of course, now whenever I tell someone where I'm going in a couple of months is Thailand and Denmark, they all look at me funny and say that's a weird combination. So I have to tell this story a lot. But so it's a really random choice. And Narelle's question of whether my audience influences like where I pick my destinations, I'm kind of aware that if I suddenly went and spent a week in a full, like a all-inclusive resort hotel in Bali, that my audience would think, what's gone wrong with Amanda? That's not the kind of thing she does. So I guess I have that in mind, but at the same time, that's because that's what I don't want to do. I don't want to have that kind of trip. So perhaps I've attracted my audience based on what I like to do and what we have in common. And so, although I think of you guys, I don't think that it influences my decision as such. All right, now Fiona went on to ask me about suggestions for destinations with interesting culture, tasty food, and low humidity. Now, I imagine that Fiona just doesn't like high humidity in general, and to be honest, I agree. But it was funny that she asked this morning, and I know Fiona's also in Perth, because Perth here in Western Australia has had very unusual high humidity for the last couple of weeks. We never get very humid weather, and especially not day after day, and it's been driving me a little bit nuts. And so I actually walked home from taking my son to school this morning. I felt like I was dripping with sweat, and then I saw Fiona's question. I just really laughed. So anyway, basically I ruled out kind of the tropical sections of Asia, but I had to include Fiona in my suggestions. Japan, because how much more of an interesting culture and tasty food can you get than Japan? Just don't go in summer when the humidity is very high. It can be quite unpleasant. On my very first full day in Japan, in fact, when I moved there back in 2001, I ended up with heat stroke, the only time ever in my life, because that weather just really knocked me around. And I was thinking about other kind of, non-tropical places, keeping this low humidity in mind. And what came to mind for me was Eastern Europe and Russia. So I don't know if tasty food is the right thing, but yeah, interesting food and definitely interesting culture and definitely low humidity. So there you go. If I had to go somewhere in that area now, I would go back to the Baltic states. So Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. They fascinate me. I have been to Estonia twice, and to Latvia and Lithuania I backpacked through both of those quite a few years back, but they were just such fascinating places, and a really interesting mix of culture, and of course the whole, Western and Eastern European kind of mix, and just really fascinating. So I don't know, they popped into my head, so that's my answer. Now, after that, Lala mentioned about kind of environmentally aware destinations, and she said she often has this kind of conversation with her friends about, is this destination, green enough? Like, if there's animal attractions, are they ethical, and all of these kinds of issues. Now, I actually remember back in episode 110, I did a special episode about 10 thoughts I'm thinking about thoughtful travel, and I did talk about this topic at some reasonable length, because it's a really interesting one to me. I remember it's really only a few years ago that I had no idea, really about kind of ethical travel issues. And, I kind of distinctly remember, must be 5 or 6 years ago, when a friend of mine, Fanny, if she's listening, hello, Fanny, she mentioned to me, oh, if you're going to Bali, don't ride the elephants, all of this, terrible stuff. And that was the first time I stopped to think about it and stopped to start and read about it. And since then, of course, I've met a bunch of really interesting bloggers and influencers who talk about these topics. For example, don't ride an elephant, or, considering your accommodation and how, ethically it's run, or how green, and all of those situations. And I think all of these issues are super important for us as thoughtful travellers. And most of the time it comes down to research and being really aware of the research you're reading and where, is it biased, and is it written by a more impartial sounding third party. And it's so hard, but I think the most important part is to try. And if you are trying to find out the right information and trying to be more ethical and environmentally friendly and staying at more sustainable destinations, then I think you're doing better than, the average traveller, and keep that up and we'll all make a big impact. My next question is another one from Kim. And Kim asked, am I the kind of person who takes just a few photos or a million photos, and how do I organise them? Now, I wish I was the kind of person who only took a few photos, because really at the end of the day, that's all I need. But, I've got my phone with me, I've got my camera with me, and I tend to take a lot of photos on both, some of which end up being very similar as well, which is a source of endless frustration for me. So I guess, Kim, I would have to say I fall into the million photos category, but I wish I wasn't. And I'm not very good at organising them. However, with one exception, I'll tell you something I'm decent at, is I do love to make photo books of my travels. And because I travel quite often, years back I would do one and it would be fancy and there'd be lots of, captions and extra bits. It was just, really detailed and took me ages to do it. But I don't have time to do that anymore. And so during last year, I stumbled across my current favourite idea. And basically, I throw a bunch of images into one of those photo books that will be printed online. But I choose templates where there's a fair bit of blank space. So I get the books, they come back to me, and then with a lovely glass of wine or my drink of choice of the day, I sit at my kitchen table with a Sharpie and I annotate those books by handwriting. So I, take my diary or anything else I need to know what things were, and I just write on it, physically into the book. And I find that kind of a really nice combination. It's almost, it's kind of got the manual touch, I suppose, but the photos are all printed out nicely, but it's a nice little trip down memory lane, both to create it and to look at it later. Now Sandra asked me about my packing style. Am I a carry-on only person or a suitcase toting kind of traveller? And the answer is I'm somewhere in between. I sometimes have travelled carry-on only. I find a lot of situations, especially, from Australia, I often do fairly long trips and carry-on doesn't work fabulously. I think it was 2 years back I did travel with my son to Singapore and Malaysia, and we did go carry-on only. And it's easier, of course, when the destination is warm and you don't need, any particularly heavy clothes. And it was only for a week or 8 days or something. So that was a time I did carry on only. My mum and I spent a couple of weeks in Russia and Estonia and Germany with carry on only. So we can do that too. But most of the time I do take more, but I tend to prefer my backpack because I like to be able to kind of hoist it up on my back and just be hands-free and walk along. Especially when my son was a bit littler and I always felt like I wanted to be able to easily hold his hand and not be worrying about pulling a suitcase as well. That's a bit easier now, and he also can take care of his own luggage. So I guess, Sandra, my answer is it depends. But above all, I'm a really light packer. So I do like to leave space for shopping depending on my destination. Like in Japan, my backpack was half empty going over, but really full coming back with all the kinds of cool stuff I could pick up in Japan. But I'm definitely a light packer. So when I can go carry on only, I do, but it doesn't always work out that way. Now, Jeff asked me about the best places to learn new languages before trips. And I don't know which are the best places, but let me tell you about my experiences. So, for example, with a language that I already know and I just need a refresh, I have loved using the Duolingo app. So, for example, last year before I returned to Japan, I used Duolingo to revise my Japanese, and that worked out brilliantly. This year, ahead of going to Denmark, I've been wanting to learn a little bit of Danish. I know it's probably not necessary because Danes, like many Scandinavians, are super multilingual, but I like learning languages and I feel it's respectful to try and learn at least a bit of the language. Plus, Danish has quite a few similarities to German, and I already speak German fluently, so it hasn't been too hard to look at a bit of Danish. And so how did I do that? I started off watching lots of Danish shows on Netflix because it's amazing what you can pick up just from repetitive, kind of the repetitive phrases that people use in TV shows. My favourite was Rita. If you haven't seen that yet on Netflix, I highly recommend it. And then I actually, in this case, did go to Duolingo, but mostly because because of the German background, it wasn't too hard to recognise, kind of patterns and stuff. But otherwise, in the past, for example, before Iceland, I tend to go to YouTube. And there's always, for every language, I think I've always found like a series of lessons where a native speaker is teaching you, especially like, Icelandic for travellers and stuff like that. And I always wish I had time. No, not had time. I always wish I'd made time to learn more before I do this, before I travel each time. And perhaps, I don't know, when I'm older, I'll have more time to do this. But, any amount of language you can learn before you travel, it just pays you back so well, so heartily, because, everyone likes to hear you trying to speak in the local language. Makes a huge difference. Now, Kate asked me for great places to take kids. So I have two parts to this answer. My first part is that I think kids can go nearly everywhere with you. And especially if you've got them used to being travellers, then it's pretty easy to take them anywhere. And there's always a kid angle to every destination, I reckon. However, I did come up with a few favourites, and I'm going to circle back to what I mentioned already before, Japan, because Japan is, I think, one of the best destinations for kids because it's so different, but there's so many parts about it that appeal to kids. For example, they have, this culture of kawaii and of manga and cartoons and comics, and there's a lot of kind of kid-like things that you can find in Japan, but, used by adults. I probably given the example before, but when I lived in Japan, my bank account was adorned with Snoopy. My, bank card for the ATM had Snoopy all over it, as did my bank book where they printed in my my statements and stuff. And that's not unusual in Japan. So for that reason, also the food I think is really accessible bit to kids because it's not spicy, which is, important. Apparently kids have all these extra taste buds, so spicy is really hard for them. I'm always wanting my son to grow out of that issue. Getting there a little bit. He can tolerate a bit now. But, who doesn't love what kid doesn't love a sushi train, zooming past you? Of course, they love that. So, yeah, Japan is I think, a really great destination for kids where they can, get to learn get to know a culture that is super different from their own, but it's not confronting, I don't know, there's enough similarities, but there's enough differences. It's just a good combo. I know I've also travelled several times in Malaysia with my son, and I find Malaysia an awesome place for kids. People are so friendly. There's lots of different foods, lots of interesting culture, and, beaches and pools and great weather for that. So I think Malaysia is awesome. And I think an underrated place to take kids is Germany. Germany is full of, I think Germany is underrated for everyone. But for example, for my son, there's all these car museums. There's, a great model railway place in Hamburg and all kinds of stuff like that. And it's also, a place where there's quite a lot of outdoor activity. There's, lots of parks and playgrounds and stuff. And the food is also, accessible as well. And, I just think, people should head to Germany more often. Now, my last question is an awesome one. It's from Eva, who has been a guest on the podcast before, and you might remember I mentioned a while back she has packed up and left her job in Germany and is travelling indefinitely for now. And at the moment she's based in Morocco, and I'm loving following her Instagram stories showing her daily Moroccan experiences. But Eva, your question made me laugh, and also just was a lovely question. She says, when will we finally take a trip together? And for me, this question sums up what exactly the last 3 years of the podcast, of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, has all been about. It is all about you awesome people. So I had not come across Eva before I started the podcast, and now I consider her an awesome friend. And I would love to take a trip with you somewhere. We just have to coordinate, my son and school and all of these other issues. But we will, I know, someday take a fabulous trip somewhere together. And in fact, there's so many of you awesome listeners I would love to take a trip with. And I know I've said it before, my big dream is that one day we can have a Thoughtful Travellers meetup, who knows where in the world, and hundreds of us can come together and just talk travel nonstop for a whole weekend. Wouldn't that be awesome? So, I thought that was a nice note to end on, because the community that we've managed to build together around the Thoughtful Travel podcast is my favourite part of it, both in the sense that I get to talk to lots of cool people when I interview my guests, lots of really interesting people I've met over the years, countless, and also because of the listeners who come and chat with me in the Facebook group or just email me and get in touch in other ways. And it's so fabulous to get to meet so many like-minded people. They're from, you're from many different countries, different age groups, different demographics, all kinds of stuff. But we have this, really deep interest in travel and exploring the world and ourselves in common. And I really, really love that. So that is all I have to tell you for episode 132 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, this very special 3rd anniversary episode. And I hope to be around, I know I'll be around in another year to bring you a 4th anniversary episode and all of the rest of them as well. Now, if you are not in the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, I highly recommend you hop over to Facebook and search for Thoughtful Travellers. We'll also leave a link in the show notes. And I'll leave a link in the show notes to a couple of the episodes I mentioned as well. The show notes for this episode will be at notaballerina.com/132. So thank you again very much for the last 3 years. And here's to goodness knows how many more years together for the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Thank you so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.